Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to introduce Ms. Kristen Schreiber.
Welcome to today's webinar on diabetes and dairy, research, recommendations, and real world. All attendees' phone lines will be muted. However, we encourage you to ask questions by typing your question in the chat feature in the lower right-hand corner of the presentation screen. It should default to all panelists when you ask the question. We will have time at the end of the presentation to respond to as many questions as possible. The webinar is being recorded and will be on nationaldairycouncil.org next week. Now I'll turn it over to our moderator, Dr. Mickey Rubin, to start the presentation.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm Mickey Rubin, Vice President of Nutrition Research at National Dairy Council, and I'll be serving as moderator for today's webinar entitled Diabetes and Dairy, Research, Recommendations, and Real World. Today's webinar is sponsored by National Dairy Council. For over 100 years, NDC has worked on behalf of dairy farmers and the dairy community to provide science-based education about the nutrition and health benefits dairy provides in a balanced meal plan. As NDC moves into its second century, our efforts are expanding to not only support the health and well-being of Americans through nutrition, but also to educate on the intersection of food, nutrition, and agriculture. The intent is to demonstrate how dairy contributes to responsible and sustainable food systems, helping lead to healthier people, vibrant communities, and a better planet. Sustainable nutrition is really an emerging field within the broader discipline of sustainability. It is the intersection of agriculture, food production, nutrition, and health. It's not only how foods contribute to nourishment and health and well-being, but also how foods contribute to economic and environmental outcomes as well. This is often referred to as the triple bottom line, in which nutrient-rich foods like dairy sit at the intersection of social, economic, and environmental aspects of sustainability, impacting not just one, but all three outcomes. The definition of sustainable diets by the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization helps emphasize the whole sustainability story, and it's more than just a carbon footprint. Sustainable diets have a low environmental impacts and contribute to food and nutrition security and to a healthy life for present and future generations. Sustainable diets are protective and respectful of biodiversity and ecosystems, culturally acceptable, accessible, economically fair and affordable, nutritionally adequate, safe, and healthy, all while optimizing natural and human resources. This definition underscores that sustainable nutrition is about a lot more than just the environment, and when it comes to the environment, it's also more than just greenhouse gases or carbon footprint. It's also about being mindful of uses of resources like water and land, and we have to understand that agriculture and nutrition must balance social, economic, and environmental priorities. It's important to remember that foundational to understanding sustainable nutrition and sustainable eating patterns is understanding how food and dietary patterns impact public health. In today's presentations, we'll be focusing on how dairy foods may impact one of the world's biggest public health concerns, type 2 diabetes. According to Centers for Disease Control, more than 29 million U.S. adults have diabetes, and 25% of them don't know it. About 86 million U.S. adults have pre-diabetes, and 90% of them don't know it. However, structured lifestyle programs that include diet and physical activity can have a profound effect and cut the risk of developing type 2 diabetes by as much as 58%. Today, we'll be focusing on one aspect of diet that, according to recent research, may have a unique impact on reducing type 2 diabetes risk: dairy foods. The research on dairy foods and type 2 diabetes risk reduction has been recognized in the last two dietary guidelines reviews of the evidence. In 2010, the review of the science indicated there was moderate evidence that milk and milk products were associated with a reduced risk of several cardiometabolic diseases, including type 2 diabetes. And then for the 2015 guidelines, in which the focus was on healthy dietary patterns, it was determined there was strong evidence for healthy eating patterns, which includes 3 servings of dairy foods, for reducing risk of type 2 diabetes. This research is foundational to dairy's contribution to sustainable eating patterns. For today's webinar, we have 2 diabetes experts from the Joslin Diabetes Center in Boston, Massachusetts. Joslin treats over 246,000 people with diabetes annually and is recognized as one of the leading centers for diabetes care. Our first presenter will be Nora Thal, a registered dietitian and certified diabetes educator who serves as clinical nutrition instructor at Joslin. Nora will be describing the role of dairy foods in healthy dietary patterns and in diabetes management. Second will be Dr. Joanna Mitri, an endocrinologist at Joslin. Dr. Mitri's presentation will focus on the most recent scientific evidence linking dairy to type 2 diabetes risk reduction, including emerging evidence that indicates a possible role for full-fat dairy foods in type 2 diabetes risk reduction. To begin our presentation, Nora, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mickey. We're going to be talking today from beautiful and cold Boston. I'm here from Joslin, where the Joslin has been taking care of patients with diabetes for over 100 years and continues to do so. As you heard Mickey talk about, diabetes is a major chronic health problem today. And one of the things that stands out for me is that we know that about 86 million people have prediabetes. Most of them don't know it. But the big news is that up to 15 to 30% of people who have prediabetes will transition to diabetes, type 2 diabetes, in 5 years if they don't lose weight through a healthy eating pattern and physical activity. And that means a huge economic cost and social cost for our country. Okay, so all of you who are dietitians out there know that for caring for diabetes, patients need to eat healthfully, they need to be physically active, and to take their medication. And then they need their healthcare team to work with them so that they can problem solve to have the best glucose control they can have. So what we're going to do today, as Mickey said, is look at the role of dairy products in a healthful diet, review what healthcare organizations recommend for the use of dairy products, and then finally get into some of the research and roles of dairy products in the prevention of diabetes and also in the management of diabetes. So over the last few years, you've probably been reading and hearing about several headlines looking at what is dairy's role in the prevention of disease, and also is full-fat dairy better than low-fat dairy? Is it something that we should go back to eating? Is fat a scourge, or is it something nutritious for us? So when we look at recommendations for dairy, we see that for age 2 and 3, it's 2 servings a day. It moves up to 2.5 servings for those children aged 4 to 8. And by the time someone is 9 or older, the recommendations are 3 servings of dairy per day. And we'll be finding out in just a couple of slides what Americans, how they meet that goal. All right. So when we look at dairy and what's a serving, there are a number of ways of looking at it. One is the USDA way, which looks at calcium intake. And what we see when you look at the slides here is that milk, it's about a cup all the way up to cottage cheese to get about 300 to 350 milligrams of calcium in a serving. So that's the USDA's serving size. But what about for diabetes? Well, Food Choice Lists for Diabetes look at dairy a little bit differently. On the one hand, some dairy falls into the carbohydrate group, and that's milk and yogurt, because they have about 13 to 15 grams of carbohydrate per serving, a cup or 6 to 8 ounces of a yogurt product. And then some dairy, such as cheese, we're really looking at as a protein source, because it has about 7 to 8 grams of protein and very little carbohydrate. In addition, some other dairy like cream cheese and sour cream are in the fat group, neither having much carbohydrate nor much protein. All right, so this is a little bit of a busy slide, but this is what I want you to get out of this slide. In the middle is what is recommended for us from the dietary guidelines for Americans to eat, and all the food groups are listed. The blue lines, the blue bars, tell us we're doing well. We're either meeting or exceeding our goals. The orange bars are just the opposite. We're doing poorly. We're either taking an excess amount or we're deficient in. Now, in terms of deficiencies, I'd like to look at the left side of the bar And you'll notice that 3/4 of the American population are not meeting goals for vegetables, for fruits, for dairy products, and healthy oil. On the other hand, we're exceeding our goals. We're exceeding our goals for saturated fat, added sugars, and also sodium. That shouldn't really come as a surprise to anyone. What's really somewhat surprising is how long it's been going on. And in addition to all of this, we're also exceeding our goals for calories, which is showing up in our excessive weight. So I talked a little bit before about what our recommendations are for dairy products per day, and now I want to show you where we are in terms of meeting those recommendations. Children, toddlers are doing well. They're meeting or exceeding the recommendations. Once we get to the beginnings of school-age children, not so good, a little bit below. But then once we get to older children all the way through adults, we're barely meeting half of the recommendations. Okay. So this slide was a surprise for me. I thought that dairy would be a real significant source of saturated fat in the diet. And though it does provide 13% of total saturated fat in the American diet, much larger things come from, you would guess it, mixed meat dishes, such as pizzas and casseroles, things that contain cheese and meats in a mixture, and also, in addition, desserts and snacks. Okay. So, what are the guidelines out there? Well, in general, most healthcare organizations recommend dairy products as part of a healthful eating pattern. Most of them at this point recommend low-fat dairy products. In addition, they're also recommending that we keep our saturated fat intake anywhere from less than 5% of total calories to less than 10%. However, the Joslin Diabetes Center, since its focus is on people with diabetes and not the general population, has been looking into these recommendations a little bit more. And it has recently redone its guidelines, and it now says it's taken a look at dairy products. And there's a couple of specific things about dairy. One is that dairy foods are a recommended source of protein for people with diabetes. And the carbohydrate part of dairy products is low glycemic index, which means that it doesn't spike blood glucose, as some other carbohydrates such as juice might spike blood glucose. In addition, that dairy products are one of the foods that are associated with preventing the development of type 2 diabetes. So again, really big news there. And third, that dairy products, even whole-fat dairy products, can be part of a healthful diet as long as one watches one's calorie needs and also one stays below 10% of total calories of saturated fat. Now, these recommendations are also in the Joslin guidelines for patients who are overweight and obese and have type 2 diabetes. So along with weight reduction guidelines and guidelines to meet targets such as lipid targets and blood pressure targets. All right, so in terms of eating patterns, both in the Mediterranean diet and the DASH diet, and especially the DASH diet, dairy products figure prominently. In addition, as I have said, dairy products are now, in terms of research, have been found in epidemiological research to be found to be one of the foods, along with nuts and leafy greens and blueberries, to be preventive of type 2 diabetes. So then, here comes the question, can we actually use whole-fat dairy products and still stay below saturated fat guidelines? So, it's doable, very doable, but it's a little tricky. You have to work at it. So this is our day with dairy, whole-fat dairy, with somebody having cereal with milk, whole-fat milk at breakfast, a chef salad, again with a glass of milk, whole-fat milk at lunch, a dinner, a low-fat dinner, and an evening snack with a glass of whole-fat milk. And as we see here, this is an 1,800-calorie diet, and we come close, very close, not exactly to the 10% saturated fat. So it does take some effort, but this is possible. And it could be even less saturated fat if someone used other vegetarian sources of protein instead of, for instance, the chicken. So if you have a patient, how this works in the real world, if you have a patient who's committed to full-fat dairy, you can tell them it is possible, but they will have to make some trade-offs in their diet. All right. So this slide looks at comparisons of different milk products, both soy milk, almond milk, and different dairy products. So I want to draw your attention to protein first. You'll notice that Greek yogurt has quite a bit more protein than any of the other items on the screen, and that almond milk is both low in carbohydrate and low in protein. So if people are using dairy as a protein source, almond milk wouldn't be a good choice. Most of these are adequate, certainly adequate in calcium. But again, rice milk will come out as high in carbohydrate and also has a high glycemic index, which I'm going to show you in the next slide. Okay, so glycemic index. Now, we all know that the glycemic index really talks about how high blood glucose rises based upon a comparison of different carbohydrates compared to either white bread or glucose. And foods that come out with a score of less than 55, they are low glycemic index. Foods on the other side, greater than 70, are high glycemic index. So when we look at this, milk and ice cream, basically all the carbohydrate-based dairy foods come out pretty low, and so does soy milk. Rice milk, though, is quite high. So if you're looking for a food that is high in protein and has a low glycemic index, dairy foods certainly fit that. So this is just kind of showing you in terms of going way back to the 1920s and 30s with Dr. Joslin, that he believed that dairy should be part of a healthful diet. And he also believed that the whole food gamut should be looked at, that all food groups should appear in the diet. And I think that's something really important. And we're going to see that a little later why I'm mentioning this. All right. So these are exchange lists. One of the ways that we teach patients how to control their diabetes with diet is the use of exchange lists, looking at starch and fruits and meats. And again, exchange lists look at the entire conception of food groups, so people have a good idea of an eating pattern. So today we look at carbohydrate counting a lot, and this really just focuses on blood glucose control. It's not really talking about a healthful eating pattern. So for people with type 2 diabetes, one of the things you'll notice is if you're male and if you exercise, you get more carbohydrate to eat. On the other hand, if you're a woman or if you're sedentary, we take away some carbohydrates from you. So, as I said, carbohydrate counting, it's minimized the focus on different food groups, and it's really concentrated just on the foods with carbohydrate, which I think is a little bit of a loss for patients. So here's a meal plan that specifies not only carbohydrates, but gives people an example of the type of carbohydrates they should be eating and spreads it out over the different food groups. And this meal plan becomes even a little more expressive in that it tells people that they should have some fruit at the meal, they should have some dairy at the meal, and they should have some grains, because all of those contribute to a healthful diet. All right. And here's our plate. I really enjoy the plate because I think it teaches visually not only what you should eat, but how much you should eat. We have a variety of different plates here, and in almost all the plates, vegetables, as you notice, take up a wide variety, a wide amount of the plate. But on all of these plates, there isn't a specific area for dairy. However, on the Jocelyn plate, you'll notice here, we've added dairy specifically, fruit specifically outside the plate, and also healthful fats, so that you have the full conception of what a healthful diet looks like. Okay, so we're now back to the beginning, and I hope I've given you a good overview of the clinical aspects of dairy in the diet, and I'd like to turn this over now to Dr. Mitri, who's going to talk to you about what's happening in the research world.
Hi everybody. So it's a pleasure to be presenting about dairy and diabetes here. So what we did here, we tried to review the literature that was for the last few years, over 10 years, to see what is out there in terms of relationship between dairy and specifically milk, cheese, and yogurt. We really didn't want to look right now at butter and other dairy products, and we wanted to see the effect or what type of relationship exists between these dairy products and glycemia in patients with diabetes or without diabetes. So we excluded from our literature search dairy studies that looked at whey or casein, and specifically the reason we excluded that because we wanted to look at the food as a whole content as compared to different specific protein or a supplement. We did not look at the pediatric population. We wanted to see only the effect in adults. So we looked at different type of studies, observational, interventional, as well as comprehensive reviews. So quickly, before I show you the results of our literature search, I wanted to differentiate what are the different type of studies that exist so you can know how to interpret the results accordingly. When we talk about interventional studies, the good thing about them is that you're minimizing confounding when you do any interventional studies. However, they are harder to conduct, and I would say it's really hard. We are conducting a study at Joslin with dairy food. It's been great so far, but I've seen on a day-to-day the struggle when you tell patients eat a certain diet and you put them in a research setting, and you don't see them every day how they're eating around it. The observational studies, on the other hand, they are much easier. The only problem with that they have unmeasured confounding that we can't really look at. We try to adjust in these observational studies for certain factors, but definitely there's a lot of things that you won't be able to adjust for. And finally, meta-analysis is that when you don't have enough data from 1 or 2 or 5 studies, or when you have heterogeneity or different type of studies that show different results, by putting all these studies together, you have a bigger power to detect a difference or not. The problem with these meta-analyses is that usually they are limited by the quality of individual studies. That means that if you're including in your meta-analysis 10 studies that have poor quality, then your results are going to be poor quality at the end. So I will start by I'm going to take you straight to the meta-analysis here because I found really a lot of observational studies looking at patients and the effect on dairy in these patients on diabetes. So a lot of meta-analysis, and some of them, like you see, some of them were done in 2013, 14, 16. So you would see that the same studies, the individual study in each meta-analysis kind of repeats some of them, and then in 2016, like you include even more studies. So if the studies included in those meta-analyses range between 5 to 22 studies, and if you look at the effect of total dairy as intake and diabetes incidence, you can see in red that there's been in 4 out of these 6 meta-analyses, there has been an inverse association of total dairy intake and diabetes. When we looked at individual dairy products such as milk, cheese, and yogurt, you would see that under the milk column, that in 2 of the meta-analyses, there was an inverse association of low-fat milk with diabetes. And also in cheese, in 2 of the meta-analyses, there was an inverse association with diabetes, as well as yogurt in 3 of the meta-analyses. And as you see, the one that I'm not mentioning there is because they show neutral effects. And then finally, when we looked at, we wanted to see whether low-fat or high-fat have a difference in terms of their incidence of diabetes. The low-fat did have an inverse association with diabetes, and the high-fat had a neutral association with diabetes. Again, these are meta-analysis results, clumping or putting together individual studies that are observational and not intervention in nature. So I would take a summary from this slide that we've seen some inverse association. We also see that there's a neutral association. The way I interpret it, there's no positive association. So there's no study saying that if you have high-fat, meta-analysis showing that if you have high-fat dairy intake or high cheese intake or high milk, you have a higher risk of diabetes. Now, when we looked at intervention studies, obviously the intervention are much smaller here. As you see in the second column, the participant number range between like 30 to 100 patients. So there's really not huge studies huge intervention studies. So, and the intervention in these studies involves giving participant dairy between 3 to 5 dairy per day and watching them over 3 to 6 months. Some of them tried to keep participants within the same weight by telling participants, make sure you substitute one item for the other. And when they looked at the glycemic outcome measure in these intervention studies, as you see also I'm summarizing so we don't have to get into each one individually, that 3 out of these 6 studies that I'm on the slide have shown an inverse association with a glycemic outcome measure, and these measures were either the HOMA-IR, which is a marker of insulin resistance. One of them showed an inverse association with insulin, which will translate into also the decreased insulin resistance. And the third one showed an inverse association with 2-hour postprandial glucose. And and the other one actually showed neutral effect, no harm on glycemic measure. Just a sample of a study just to show you how these studies are done. It's a small study, 23 healthy individuals, and the design was a randomized crossover, which means they put them on that daily for a few months and then they switch them to the other arm. So the intervention included the habitual diet plus 4 servings of dairy per day versus low dairy, less than 2 servings per day. And they asked participants to maintain the same amount of energy from food they were having. And if you look here at the effect on glucose, insulin, and HOMA-IR, I will just make it in big because I know. So the glucose remains the same in both groups, whether you're on the high dairy versus low dairy. However, at the end of the intervention, the insulin was lower in the high dairy group. That means when you have a lower insulin with the same glucose, that means the insulin resistance and lower in the high dairy group. Since the insulin resistance is basically a formula where you have glucose over insulin. So there's the question is if there is a benefit, assuming, we looked at observational study, summary of observational study and intervention studies, of course with their limitations, but if there's a benefit in terms of glycemia, why would that be? There's a few studies looking at dairy-derived fatty acids specifically, showing that it's possibly that the fatty acid itself of the dairy is different than other fatty acids, because you probably know that saturated fat in general might not be ideal for patients with diabetes or without diabetes, but specifically dairy fat itself might have a different effect. Probiotic that's present in the fermented dairy also could be contributing to the benefit. There's a lot of studies on whey protein that you probably have seen looking at, and that's why you see in a lot of stores just trying to sell whey by itself because of the cardiometabolic benefit of these proteins. Calcium, vitamin D, and magnesium also, a lot of studies out there. I myself, before focusing more on dairy and nutrition, I did a lot of studies with calcium and vitamin D looking at the effect of those in diabetes and pre-diabetes, and there's a lot to talk about how much it is possible that this could be contributing. Again, it's not, even until now, studies are looking, could it be the calcium? It's hard to say, is it only the calcium, is it the fermentation, or is it a combination of everything that is in the dairy? The amino acids of the dairy also could be contributing to the glycemic effect. Now, is dairy fat different? I mean, I just mentioned earlier that saturated fat could be harmful in general, but what is dairy fat different? So the dairy fat consists of 60% is saturated and consists of the long-chain saturated fat, which is the myristic, auric, and palmitic acid, and the odd-chain, which are I would just put the number 15, 0, and 17, 0. So the odd-chain saturated fatty acid, actually, they are a marker of dairy, I would say. So you will see a lot of the other fatty acid and other saturated fat, but if you really want to look at a dairy product, looking at those saturated fats, which tend to be found only or mainly in dairy, are a good marker of dairy intake. And then the other, you have 5% that is trans fatty acid, and the studies have shown that this type of trans fatty acid, they have with the transpalmitoleic acid, they did not have any association with ischemic heart disease or stroke. The reason I mentioned that because we're all concerned about could trans fatty acid could be harmful in terms of and CVDs, and we know that, yeah, we want to try to decrease in general saturated fat. That's why the guidelines recommend less than 10%, but possibly the dairy fat, and again, it's not confirmed, but studies looking at dairy fat specifically, whether they have a different, by the nature of their constitution, could they have a different effect on cardiometabolic outcomes. This is, so I'm not sure why it says interventions. Oh, okay. So in this study, this is not really an example. This study, they looked at the incidence of diabetes in the nurse health study and the health professional follow-up study. It's really not an intervention study. I apologize for that. So they looked at patients over 15 years, and over 15 years follow-up, there were 277 cases of diabetes in these 3,000 patients, and they measured specifically plasma fatty acid, which I was mentioning earlier. So if you can see here, it might be too small, but if you see that when they put that in the model, so you can see that the incidence of diabetes was lower with these plasma fatty acids, and specifically the 15-0 and 17-0 that I mentioned earlier, which are really typical, not typical, which are really mainly found in dairy products as compared to other saturated fats. This is another study that looked at whether if you replace dairy fat with animal fat or other type of fat, and as you can see here on the red, actually myself I cannot see them, but if you replace dairy fat with animal fat, you have you will see, probably you can't read the number, but you can see that it's on the right side of the vertical line, and when it's on the right side, it's a higher risk, and in this case, it is significant. So the relative risk of CVD and CHD and stroke is higher when you substitute dairy fat with animal fat. However, when you replace dairy fat with a whole grain or polyunsaturated fat, actually the risk was lower. What I would mention here, not to confuse you, I just wanted to show all different kind of study, whatever has shown positive or negative, but I wanted to show it to you basically also to make sure you're aware that here they are, the way they did this study is that they're modeling, they're trying to see whether you substitute a fat and not a whole food. When we talk about food, we can't just remove one piece of the food and then look. It is possible that dairy itself, dairy, as you know, is a combination of fat, protein, and everything that comes with it. It's not necessary, so you can't just take just the fat out and replace it with something else. But again, if you, in general, try to replace all the fat with animal fat, then yeah, you would decrease your risk of CVDs. Did I miss a slide? No. Okay. So next, the famous Malmo diet study that was done in Sweden. This study showed that there was an inverse association with cream and high fermented milk, and for cheese also with incident diabetes, but it's a little bit different than what we saw earlier from the meta-analysis that I showed earlier, but this is a study that came more recent, so it's one of the newer observational studies showing that high-fat dairy was inversely associated with diabetes. This is basically just showing those results. You might not see them, but showing that when they looked at dairy products, high fat is technically associated with lower risk, and then when you see they looked at also lower fat or whether it's fermented or not. But it showed in summary that higher fat was associated with lower risk of diabetes. Now, in summary, the observational studies showed that dairy intake is associated with lower incidence of diabetes. Whether this observed association is related to high-fat dairy versus low-fat dairy, it remains unclear. We don't have well-conducted randomized clinical trials looking at the effect of dairy in diabetes. As I said, randomized trials are the best scenario where you can look to confirm that, because when you do an observation, you can't really confirm because observations have a lot of confounding in them, but we don't have this data. And at Joslin, we are running a randomized clinical trial looking at the effect of dairy in patients with diabetes. And then finally, I would say that the recommendation for low-fat versus high-fat dairy should consider preferences, total caloric intake, and lipid profile. You definitely don't want to tell a patient with an LDL of 160 and you're really having a hard time bringing the LDL down, LDL cholesterol, tell them it's okay to eat high-fat dairy. So as long as you take that into the clinical context, as Nora mentioned earlier, if you're going to have fat anyway, why not to take it if that's what you really like. So as long as it's within the calorific intake and with clinical allowance, that should be fine. And then I will pass it on to Nora.
Okay, I'm back. So when we talk to patients, what should we tell them? Well, I think we're still talking to them about the healthful plate and that dairy has a place in it. And like Dr. Mitri showed on the studies, we do know that most of the epidemiological studies do show that low-fat dairy is associated with good, healthy outcomes and possibly the reduction of incidence of type 2 diabetes. So low-fat dairy always has the place. If a person is truly wedded to high-fat dairy, let's say they like pizza on Friday nights, then I would talk to the patient, see what else they were eating in the diet, what they were willing to switch, what their blood glucose looked like, and tell them, you know, if things looked right, if they were able to manage it, then that's what we'd work on doing. Okay, so carb quality in general. milk and yogurt are right up there with high-quality carbs such as fruit and vegetables, legumes. Again, the recommendations are for 3 servings a day. Most adults that I know are not doing that. But there are lots of ways to get in healthful dairy, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. But we're also going to talk about carbohydrates we can avoid more of, which are, as we know, a lot of white-floured, refined carbohydrates for people with diabetes and even people without who are watching their weight, a reduction in fruit juice and beverages, sugar-sweetened beverages. Okay, so how can we get more dairy into your diet? If you're interested in the health properties of dairy, and if you like dairy, how do we get it in? So some basic things. I think some easy things. What about a piece of low-fat or regular cheese, a small piece of cheese on sandwiches? What about using milk instead of water for hot cereals? What about making a really nice yogurt parfait using, in my case, low-fat yogurt, but if someone likes regular yogurt or yogurt parfait, even a cafe latte, as coffee is one of the things associated, coffees and teas are associated with a reduction of diabetes, so you get a 2-for-1 with that. And I think for a lot of patients who are overweight, a nice treat is fresh vegetables cut up in an attractive manner with a yogurt with some herbs and spices in it as a dip. Okay. And so I also wanted to give you, on your screen, you can see where you can get some additional resources. There's a handout, Healthy Habits to Prevent Diabetes, and the website for talking with your patients about diabetes prevention and pre-diabetes. And I want to thank everybody for listening to us today, and we look forward to any questions that you might have. Oh, oops. I'm sorry. I forgot this slide. This is, again, just showing that dairy products are important in the prevention of diabetes.
Okay, great. Thank you, Nora, and thank you, Dr. Mitri, for those great presentations. We have a couple of questions here that I'll ask from our queue. The first question pertains to lactose intolerance. What would you recommend for people with lactose intolerance? I think maybe this might be a question for you, Nora, in your practice. I know we get this question a lot here at NDC, and we tend to point out that there are, lactose-free cow's milk options on the market, or hard cheeses. Natural cheeses actually have negligible amounts of lactose. How do you usually address the question of lactose intolerance for your patients, Nora?
As you know, or patients may know, lactose intolerance really is a continuum, so that there are some people who are acutely and severely lactose intolerant, and if they have even a soup base that has a little bit of lactose in it, they feel, the consequences. And then other people can tolerate almost up to a whole glass of milk if taken in small amounts throughout the day. So I usually tell people kind of to find out, what they can tolerate. I direct them toward cheeses because hard cheeses have less than 1 gram of lactose, so that's a possibility. I can tell them that they can take small amounts of dairy. They can use Lactaid milk. They can also use the Lactaid pills when they're going to eat something with dairy. And if they, are exquisitely lactose intolerant, then there are other sources of calcium in the diet other than dairy.
Great. Thank you, Nora. Let's move on to another question. And this one I think is for Dr. Mitri. Dr. Mitri, in your review of the literature, are there particular dairy foods that stand out as having a greater impact when you're looking at the role of dairy in reducing risk for diabetes?
I mean, based on my literature search, and also I have to say my personal opinion and my previous research, I would think that the fermented dairy would be my preferred, although, I did show that low-fat milk has a lower association with diabetes on the slide. I know I showed that. but from reading about mechanism and just also reading about the effect, we can't avoid really the effect of fermentation. I think something is there that explain that these fermented dairy could, if I have to pick, that would be my preference, any dairy that is fermented.
Great, thank you. Next question. I think this one would be for Nora. If you have a patient that doesn't necessarily have a preference in terms of fat level of milk, which one would you generally recommend to start with?
Certainly. I mean, it's my preference. I wouldn't go out and recommend high-fat dairy to patients right now. I don't think we've proven that high-fat dairy is a thing to do. I would always start with skim milk, for example, or 1% milk. It's only in the case of somebody who says, I'm not going to take any of this unless I drink my full-fat milk, that I would say, well, let's look at your lipid profile, let's look at your glycemic control, and let's see what you're willing to trade. And if that person, then I would say to that person, okay, maybe you could have one serving of high-fat dairy for the day, and the rest could be low-fat or non-fat.
Great. And related to that, another question came in. What about patients that really would only drink flavored or chocolate milk? How would you approach that?
So if we're dealing with the regular population, there are low-fat chocolate milk servings out there. In terms of carbohydrate, it can be slightly different, and it would depend for a patient of diabetes whether they're adjusting their insulin for their carb intake or whether they're taking an oral medication. I would basically say to them, well, why don't you test it out, take your blood glucose before and take your blood glucose after and see what happens. And it also would depend on how much they're drinking. There's a difference between drinking a glass of chocolate milk once a week and having 4 glasses of chocolate milk a day.
Maybe I would add, I mean, that's really based on my experience with my kids. My kids, every time I'm at the store, they really just want the flavored milk. Which is fine, they're kids, they're 4- and 6-year-olds. But what I do to curb that appetite or that the way they look at that, I just say, okay, for the strawberry milk, I'll just get this bunch of strawberries, which of course they are high also in glycemic index, but I know that strawberries are better than just the sugar that is added. So I just mix it for them, and I make all sorts of smoothies. So I think it's just how, in terms of nutrition, how you want to counsel your patient on what type of food you can eat and combine. Just at least if you want to get something sweet, get some benefit from it, some vitamins. That's how I would put it.
Excellent. Here's another interesting question. Are you aware of any research that shows that caffeine consumption might affect calcium absorption? We've actually gotten this question here at NDC ourselves several times, and my understanding of the literature is that it may slightly affect calcium absorption, but that could be overcome by, as little as a cup or 2 of milk. But are you aware of anything in this area of caffeine and calcium absorption?
I'm personally, Nora, do you have any? No,
nothing.
I'm not sure it's really what are the studies out there showing that. I can't speak to that, but I'm definitely happy to look it up and get back to the audience.
Great, thank you. And here's another one, and Dr. Mitri, this one might be a good one for you, related to your discussion previously about recommending fermented foods showing some most favorable outcomes in diabetes. Does dairy fat impact the microbiome?
So I think there's probably what with dairy in general and the fermented one, it is possible that it's altering, yes, the microbiome, and that's why we know that the microbiome have a big role in diabetes prevention, in diabetes development. Like right now, we're all looking at whether could microbiome lead the change in microbiome could lead to development of diabetes. And there is some studies looking at that with dairy fermented or the dairy fat could be possibly altering that. Not a lot of there, but it is possible that this is the mechanism.
Okay, great, thank you. And I think we have just one last question. Would you recommend fuller fat dairy if it was in the 1 to 2 servings range for weight management purposes? I think maybe this question is getting to potentially a satiety effect of consuming a fuller fat dairy product. I'll leave it to either one of you to take that one.
What is the, sorry, the question really is, would you recommend using full fat dairy for its satiety, 1 to 2 servings a day for its satiety? I think that I think the questionnaire is correct that fat, that having some fat in the diet helps with satiety. But if I were to choose fats, I think I would choose more of the poly and monounsaturated fats first. Like, what about having some low-fat dairy with some nuts? You get the benefits of both the monounsaturated fats or polyunsaturated fats, and you get the protein and calcium from the dairy.
So I wouldn't go and push for that just because there is still that concern. So I wouldn't go and push for full-fat dairy by itself. I think what I showed here, or what the literature has shown, is that there's probably no harm of the dairy fat itself. But to go and say, yes, have that, what I really didn't show you, and I think maybe that would be nice to show, is that a lot of the studies have shown that the relationship with the benefit of these dairy products is nonlinear. And what that means is that you would read it, I mean, a lot of you might read it and wonder what that means. When you see a linear relationship, it means that the more you have of something, the more that you have a benefit or a risk. So what I saw here in the study is that there is a nonlinear relationship. So I wouldn't go and tell patients that, and that's not to answer specifically your question, but if I see that there is something that could be good, I wouldn't go and say consume so much of it just because good, especially for yogurt that applied, there's really nonlinearity. That means not more than 3 or 4 servings a day, that beyond that there's no benefit actually. So then going back to the question, do I just go and say do full-fat milk? I don't know that this intervention by itself has been successful. It hasn't been tested. But I do know that in our studies we're looking at 3 arms here, full-fat versus low-fat versus regular diet, and we're looking at the effect at least in 6 months period to see whether if you do 6-fat with weight maintenance, you will have a lower weight, not with weight maintenance, sorry, with the same caloric intake. If at the end of the 6 months, just by including dairy fat, you might get full and maybe, could you have a better A1C or lower weight, we're looking at that.
I just wanted to add that I don't think either Dr. Mitra or I are proponents of changing from a recommendation of low-fat dairy to a recommendation of high-fat dairy. We're just saying that high-fat dairy right now is neutral in terms of its effect on diabetes, and that for those patients who prefer high-fat dairy and don't want to make the change to low-fat dairy, at the moment we can say it doesn't seem to have a negative effect. With that, pretty much.
Yeah, I think the most important take-home message that I saw that and Nora's mentioning is that we didn't see specific harm related to dairy fat by itself. I think the reason we keep mentioning what is the concern with the high fat, as I mentioned, there is concern that saturated fat itself is not a good environment for glucose, and I'm talking mainly in diabetes as this is our field here, that it might increase insulin resistance. However, when looking at dairy fat specifically, I didn't see worse insulin resistance just by looking at dairy fat compared to other saturated fats.
Okay, great. Thank you. And I think that will be it for all our questions that we have time for today. So thank you very much, Nora and Dr. Mitri, for your time and your presentations and answering the questions. I'm going to turn it over to Kristen Schreiber now with some final wrap-up thoughts.
Great. Thanks, Mickey. So as a reminder, the webinar is being recorded and will be on nationaldairycouncil.org next week. And thank you all so much for joining.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you to everyone for attending today. This will conclude our conference call and webinar, and you may now disconnect.